everyone. Thank you for attending this talk. My name is Shubham, and this is going to be a lightning talk about a joint work with uh, Professor Paul Massett and Professor Debba Ba titled Implicit Generative Models Using Kernel Similarity Matching. As we all know, that representation learning has been a burgeoning area of research which ties together the fields of both AI and neuroscience and is one of the principal tools of understanding and engineering the networks that facilitate these complex computations. Recent works have focused on learning representations through this idea of self-comparison, which colloquially is known as self-supervised learning in literature. In machine learning, such approaches have yielded robust representations in scarcely labeled regimes. Some recent examples include architectures such as the Siamese networks and Sinclair that exploit the relationships between like and unlike examples to learn representations. In neuroscience, these approaches have been used to explain neural observations through mechanistic models with Hebbian and anti-Hebbian plasticity. Here I show an example of a ringed tractor navigation system in fruit fly that was learned using these kinds of approaches. On a high level, the equation governing representation learning in these models can be given as this, where Kx is a measure of an input correlation and Kz is a measure of the representation or the latent correlation. T here measures the distance between these two kernels. Uh, and C represents the constraint set. In most scenarios, this formulation allows us to learn a mapping from X to Z, raising the question, is it possible to learn a map from Z to X, which essentially leads to a generative model? In the next few slides, we consider a case in which suggests that learning the kernel structure in the latent space could allow us to implicitly capture this map from Z to X. So sparse dictionary learning are a class of generative models that have that can be used to learn parsimonious representations from the input data and have been widely used to explain visual receptive fields in the visual cortex. The mathematical formulation is given as follows. By flipping the order of the optimization and solving the problem with respect to A and substituting, we can reformulate the objective as shown here. This is essentially now a kernel matching problem with a constraint on the kernel structure in the latent space, and the prediction can now be given uh, as shown here, with the implicit map between Z and X being formulated in terms of the representations Z and the kernel matrix H. Furthermore, modifying the constraints on this problem allow us to learn different behaviors. We examine the case where constraints lie on a probability simplex, which are similar to imposing metabolic constraints for the neural activity. And we later show that this actually leads to learning the input manifold by placing receptive fields in a manner that tiles the manifold. After framing the optimization problem, the question becomes how do we go about solving it? And there are essentially three steps involved here. We first convert it into a separable objective by formulating an online optimization problem. For the constraint, we formulate a Lagrangian to deal with that constraint and convert it into an unconstrained problem. And finally, to solve the Lagrangian, we develop a novel alternate method of multiplier space algorithm that basically allows us to visualize the dynamics involved for each of the optimization variables and optimize it in a sequential manner. We ran the algorithm for a few different cases, as alluded to before. Uh, for the sparse dictionary learning case, we you can see the estimated and the true dictionaries for the simulated data sets in a dimension of 30. Um, you can also see the learned atoms for MNIST digits and the patches extracted from natural images. For representations lying on the probability simplex, um, we can see that the atoms are able to like tile the manifold piecewise manner with the support of the latent or the number of non-zero elements in the latent, calculating the giving related to the is connected to the intrinsic dimensionality of the manifold. Given this idea, we dis we formulate like a neurally plausible architecture that could help us implement the above objective. Y is an intermediate representation which interacts with the downstream neuron Z through an interneuron zeta that modulates the difference between Y and omega Z, which facilitates a top-down and bottom-up interaction for representation learning. Here, omega models the latent kernel structure. We show the results of the architecture on a simulated case below, where no constraints were imposed on omega and all learning rules were Hebbian or anti-Hebbian in nature. However, more work needs to be done to identify neurally plausible ways on imposing constraints on the latent kernel structure. In summary, our work focuses on adapting kernel matching for representation learning in a generative framework. This can also lead to architectures with predictive mechanisms of representation learning, which can incorporate both top-down and bottom-up computation. Hierarchical extensions can help us model multi-level processing as well. And finally, the question remains that are there other interesting kernel structures that could be modeled and be relevant through in the study of these kinds of architectures? Thanks for your attention, and these are the acknowledgements.